300 million years ago, the air on this planet contained so much oxygen that the world itself was flammable. Forests burned on a schedule. Insects grew wider than hawks. A millipede, the length of a car, crawled through swamps that would one day become the coal powering your city. For a century, we thought we understood why. We were wrong. In March of 2026, a paper in Nature dismantled the oxygen story, the one explanation everyone agreed on. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. Part 1. The air that changed everything. You are breathing right now. The oxygen entering your lungs makes up about 20% of the air around you. This percentage has been relatively stable for millions of years, which is convenient for those of us who depend on it. But 359 million years ago, the world inhaled something much deeper. The Carboniferous period opened with an atmosphere that would suffocate you in minutes. By the end of this 60 million year epoch, oxygen had risen from a mere 15 to 20%, already substantial, to an almost incomprehensible 25 to 35%. Scientists have spent a century marveling at this fact, constructing elegant theories about what this hyperoxic air made possible. Giant insects, massive millipedes, forest canopies that stretched for miles. The assumption was simple. More oxygen meant bigger bodies, because insects breathe through tiny tubes called trachea, and thicker air allowed their passive diffusion system to supply larger frames. A clean, intuitive explanation. Except in March of 2026, a team at the University of Pretoria published their findings in Nature, and they upended that assumption entirely. Snelling and colleagues presented evidence that oxygen was not, in fact, the limiting factor at all. The tracheal tube hypothesis crumbles when you examine the data closely. If oxygen alone determined body size in insects, why did some creatures push far larger than others should have been able to grow? Why did the giants appear at times when oxygen was not at its peak? The scientific community is in live debate right now. In your present moment, what seemed settled is open again. The Carboniferous stretched from 359 million years ago to 299 million years ago. You will hear its name and remember coal. The period was named by 19th century geologists who found coal seams as deep as mountains, layer upon layer, rich enough to power the Industrial Revolution for centuries. They knew something truly alien had occurred to make such abundance. Coal is compressed ancient plant material. It requires time, pressure, and a very specific set of conditions. Those conditions dominated this world. Geography in the Carboniferous was not the world you know. Britain sat at the equator. The massive continental plates were crashing together in a slow-motion collision that would take millions of years to complete. Laurussia and Gondwana, two enormous landmasses grinding toward each other as the supercontinent Pangaea took shape. The collision raised mountains. It created highlands and valleys. It trapped vast seas. The climate oscillated between roughly 20 degrees Celsius in the early period warm, tropical, humid, down to 12 degrees Celsius during the glacial phases. Cold water from the poles crept toward the equator, then it retreated. The cycles repeated, each one lasting hundreds of thousands of years. A world in flux, a world that never stabilized, a world that remained fundamentally unstable for the entire duration of the epoch. Close your eyes and imagine the sensory world. The air itself feels alien. It is denser than what you breathe, pressing against your skin as if you have descended underwater without diving. The oxygen alone accounts for some of this sensation. It is simply more of it, and your body would feel strange in it. Humidity smothers the land, not the clean humidity of a spring morning, but the oppressive thickness of a swamp, a greenhouse, a dungeon where the air has not moved in weeks. You can feel it coating your skin, filling your nostrils, making every breath wet. The smell is what keeps you breathing through your mouth. Rotting vegetation produces methane, and hydrogen sulfide. The stench of decay that cannot finish, that accumulates and lingers. Ozone crackles through the air when lightning strikes, which is often the sharp, ionized tang of it, almost metallic. Wildfire smoke hangs in pockets, acrid and unshakable, mixing with the vegetative reek into something that fills your sinuses and makes your eyes water. And beneath it all, a sound that modernity has almost erased, the buzz of insects, not the gentle hum of a few cicadas on a summer evening. This is the roar of 10,000 wings, a sound like standing near a transformer substation or next to a highway overpass, the constant, overwhelming drone of a million creatures all moving at once. Creatures larger than birds, crossing the sky in predatory silence, their wings making a noise the plants themselves would have learned to recognize as danger. There is no bird song because there are no birds. There are no mammal cries, no frog calls, no chorus of vertebrate life. The world belongs to arthropods. Scientists divide the Carboniferous into two sub-periods. The Mississippian came first, spanning from 358.9 million years ago to 323.2 million years ago. It was named for the river where its rocks were first formally studied in North America, a naming convention that seems quaint now when we understand the rocks span an entire continent. The Pennsylvanian followed, lasting from 323.2 million years ago until the end of the period at 298.9 million years ago. The Pennsylvanian, by some measures, remains the more famous, the more intensely studied, because it contains the greatest coal deposits and the most abundant fossils. You will hear both names in what comes next. You will need to know that they represent a single, unified world, a world changing, yes, but changing gradually, over millions of years, so gradually that nothing living through those changes could have felt them shift. A creature born in the middle Mississippian and living a full lifespan would perceive no significant environmental change. And yet, after millions of individuals, after hundreds of generations, the world would be transformed. The central mystery, the tease, that draws us into this period is that if the textbook oxygen story is wrong, if higher oxygen did not mechanically force the evolution of giantism, then what is the actual mechanism? We are looking at our best understanding of 60 million years of life and realizing that our best understanding might be fundamentally incomplete. This is not a comfortable realization. Science does not like having to start over, but the evidence demands it. We must acknowledge that the simple explanation more oxygen equals bigger bodies cannot account for what we observe in the fossil record. And if that simple explanation fails, then we must ask harder questions. What drove the evolution of giants? Why did some insects exceed all modern analogues? Why did some millipedes reach the size of large dogs? The answers are not yet clear. The answers may require a complete rethinking of what we believe we know about the relationship between atmosphere and evolution. This opens a door, and through that door we must now step, because the first thing waiting for us in that Carboniferous world is a forest unlike anything that existed before or since. A forest so remarkable that the very ground refused to give up its dead. A forest where the dead accumulated and refused to decay, building up in layers so thick that eventually they compressed into rock. A forest that would eventually, impossibly, become fuel. That transformation is coming. Part 2. The forests nobody could rot. Imagine a forest where nothing dies properly, where fallen trees lie exactly where they collapse, year after year, century after century, slowly compressing under the weight of new life pressing down from above. Imagine that forest stretching across an entire continent. Imagine the smell, the taste of the air, the weight of it in your lungs. The Carboniferous forests were not made of trees as you understand them. The giants of this world were lepidodendron, sometimes called the scale trees. A mature specimen towered 40 meters high, taller than a 13-story building, the equivalent of a modern office tower that requires an elevator to reach its peak. The trunk was perhaps 2 meters in diameter, thick and substantial, capable of bearing enormous weight. But Lepidodendron was not a tree. It was a club moss, a lycopsid, and its closest living relatives today are small plants that creep along forest floors, rarely exceeding 30 centimeters in height. The scale trees of the Carboniferous were evolutionary experiments, pushing their genetic blueprint to its maximum possible size, and that maximum was staggering. The bark was distinctive, marked with diamond-shaped scars where leaves had fallen, a pattern that persists in the fossil record so clearly that you can run your hand across a rock from 300 million years ago and feel the geometry of its vanished bark. Sigillaria, another lycopsid equally imposing, displayed a different pattern, deep, ribbed, columnar bark that resembled the skin of some ancient reptile frozen in stone. These vertical grooves were not random. They represented the attachment points of leaves that once spiraled up the trunk, each one a scar left by countless seasons of growth. Beside these stood other giants, seed ferns called Glossopteris, which would later dominate the Permian world, already present in the Carboniferous forests, their compound fronds creating a different texture in the canopy. Tree ferns called Psironius, their delicate fronds spreading at the crown like something that belonged in a dreamscape rather than a real world. And calamites, the giant horsetails, which reached 20 meters into the sky, not quite the height of the scale trees, but substantial nonetheless, a living reminder that modern horsetails, the tiny relatives of Equisetum, are dwarfed descendants of Carboniferous giants. The forest floor was not a place of individual trees spaced for aesthetic drama. It was a wall of vegetation. Fallen trunks formed a network of obstacles, some still partially upright, others prone and waterlogged. Standing water pooled everywhere, fed by constant rainfall and drained by sluggish rivers that took weeks to move miles. The ground was pure peat, accumulating faster than decomposition could reduce it. This was not the dark, rich soil of a modern forest. This was the slow, incomplete breakdown of an entire ecosystem into mineral soup. The peat was waterlogged, not wet, but saturated, anaerobic, the oxygen stripped away by standing water and the absence of proper drainage. Beneath this soup lay the root systems of these giants. Stigmaria roots, thick and spreading, penetrated the submerged forest floor like the appendages of some vast organism trying to anchor itself against the weight of existence. The air above this soup was thick with spores. Lepidodendron, Sigillaria, calamites, all reproduced via spores, clouds of them, so abundant that they settled on every surface like dust in an unused house, coating leaves and branches and the skin of any creature foolish enough to linger too long in the fern groves. But here is where the mystery deepens. There were no flowers in these forests, none. No fruit, no grass, no legumes, no seeds as you would recognize them. This was a world of sporophytes and gametophytes, of a reproductive strategy so foreign to modern experience that it requires an effort of imagination to envision it. Yet these forests covered the planet. The strangest thing about the Carboniferous is not its size or its dominance. It is the absolute absence of anything you would recognize as a seed plant. The central question: why did the Carboniferous accumulate coal? For a century, the answer seemed obvious. Oxygen was rising to unprecedented levels. Decomposition requires oxygen, bacteria, and fungi need it to break down organic material. But wait, if oxygen was rising, decomposition should have been faster, not slower. Something else was preventing the forest from returning to the soil. In 2012, Flouders and colleagues published groundbreaking research in Science, identifying white rot fungi as the key innovation in wood decomposition. These fungi produce enzymes that break down lignin, the tough polymer that gives wood its strength. The thinking was, perhaps the Carboniferous lacked these fungi. Perhaps decomposition was literally impossible. But in 2016, Nelson and other researchers pushed back, presenting evidence in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that complicated this picture. They demonstrated that the lycopsids themselves, the scale trees, had comparatively little lignin in their tissue compared to modern wood. The coal that formed from these trees should have decomposed readily if the anaerobic explanation alone were correct, yet it did not decompose. Something else was at work, multiple factors interacting. An ecosystem locked in place not by a single absent enzyme, but by a constellation of conditions, all reinforcing each other. Today, most paleontologists agree on this much. The coal forests existed in anaerobic, waterlogged conditions. Standing water meant no oxygen in the soil. No oxygen meant no aerobic bacteria. No aerobic bacteria meant no decay. The peat accumulated, layer after layer, compressed under pressure, exposed to heat, transformed into coal. The Mason Creek deposits of Illinois preserve this moment in exquisite detail, capturing entire ecosystems in siderite concretions. The coal measures of Yorkshire and the Appalachian Basin built monuments to compression, mountains of accumulated plant material stacked one atop the other. The Joggins fossil cliffs of Nova Scotia, in the Bay of Fundy, expose the record metre by metre, the tides of that massive bay revealing new fossils each season, year after year, in an endless slow excavation of the Carboniferous. On a planetary scale, this was a catastrophe of the generative kind. Carbon that had been in the air in the form of carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, was being buried beneath the earth. Millions upon millions of tons of it, every million years, locked away. The atmosphere was being drained of CO2. The greenhouse effect was collapsing. Ice sheets were forming, advancing from the poles toward the equator. The climate was cooling. Every lump of coal burned during the Industrial Revolution was a direct legacy of the Carboniferous. You could hold a piece of anthracite, the hardest coal, and know with absolute certainty that the photons captured by ancient plants 300 million years ago were being released into your 21st century atmosphere. This is the terrible irony at the heart of the fossil fuel economy. The forests that could not rot became the fuel that created the industrial world. And now we are burning them for the second time, completing a carbon cycle begun 300 million years ago in the span of 2 centuries. The Carboniferous is not history. It is the present moment. The coal still burning, the carbon still being released, the planetary consequences still unfolding. But as we venture deeper into those forests, as we imagine ourselves walking among those impossible plants, we must confront something even more remarkable. The forest floor was not empty of animal life. Something large moved through the darkness below the canopy, something that had never existed before, something that would change the world. The ground itself was about to start shaking. Part 3. The Monster in the Mud. In January of 2018, a fossil hunter near Howick Bay in Northumberland, England, broke through rock that had not been disturbed in 326 million years. What emerged was a segment of exoskeleton. A single segment, 75 centimeters long, too large to fit in an adult human hand, too large to be anything known to modern biology. For years, researchers worked to reconstruct the full animal from fragments. Paleontologists are accustomed to working with incomplete specimens, a few bones here, a bit of skull there, never a complete skeleton, except in the rarest cases. But Arthropleura was not a skeleton. It was an exoskeleton, segmented armor that could fossilize in pieces because each segment could separate after death. By the time the fossil papers were published in 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025, a picture had emerged that was both precise and deeply strange. The creature was Arthropleura. The full length of the animal, from head to tail, measured 2.63 meters, 4 centimeters shorter, and it would have been less than 9 feet, but it was not. It was longer than an adult human is tall. It extended beyond the height of a human body by a comfortable margin. It weighed about 50 kilograms, roughly the weight of a large Labrador retriever or a substantial human adolescent. In other words, something the size and heft of an adult dog was crawling through the Carboniferous forest floor on dozens of legs, moving through the darkness, feeding on spores, leaving trackways that would be discovered hundreds of millions of years later. It is the largest land invertebrate ever to have existed. No arthropod has ever exceeded it. No creature with an exoskeleton has come close. Arthropleura stands alone at the apex of the invertebrate size hierarchy, a record that has endured for nearly 300 million years. Trackways preserved in the rock show paired grooves, each wider than human shoulders. Two trails, one beside the other, made by the paired legs pressing into soft peat as the creature moved. When you stand before a trackway and measure the distance between the marks, when you calculate the stride length, something remarkable emerges. Arthropleura was not a slow creature. It could move at considerable speed. Research on the biomechanics of its locomotion suggests it was capable of sustained movement through the forest at speeds modern centipedes cannot achieve. This was not a sluggish browser. This was a creature that moved with purpose, with power, with the kind of swift mobility that might indicate hunting behavior despite its apparent herbivory. It was a vegetarian, not a predator, not a scavenger, a browser. Arthropleura fed on the abundant spores of the lycopodiophytes that dominated the forest, those powdery clouds of reproductive cells that covered every surface. It also consumed plant debris, the detritus of a plant-dominated world where almost everything that fell was made of organic matter that had not yet begun to decay. It moved through the understory, through the darkness beneath the 40-meter scale trees, grazing in groves of smaller plants, using its considerable speed to move between feeding patches in the vast, unlit forest floor. Then, in 2024, researchers published breakthrough findings in Science Advances. They had discovered juvenile Arthropleura specimens preserved in the Monceau-les-Mines deposits in France. Using CT scanning technology, they had imaged the head of a young specimen without destroying the fossil. For the first time in the entire history of paleontology, we had a clear picture of what the head of Arthropleura actually looked like. Stalked eyes, short antennae, internal mandibles feeding structures hidden within the head capsule rather than protruding visibly. The anatomy was clear enough to place the creature decisively within Myriapoda, the group that includes modern centipedes and millipedes. But there is a problem that keeps paleontologists awake. No adult head has ever been found. Not one. Not in situ, not complete, not even partially preserved in direct association with body segments. We know what adolescent Arthropleura looked like. We know what its rear segments looked like. But the grown animal, the creature in its full power, the version that would have been most dangerous to encounter, we have never seen its face. That head remains one of the great mysteries of paleontology. Did it change shape as the creature matured? Did it develop elaborate structures we cannot imagine? Did it acquire something predatory in appearance despite its herbivorous diet? We simply do not know. The oxygen problem adds to this mystery. The Howick Bay specimen, at 326 million years ago, was older than the peak of Carboniferous oxygen levels. It lived when oxygen was only around 23% of the atmosphere. So the elegant explanation, more oxygen equals bigger bodies, does not work for Arthropleura. It existed before the oxygen spike. Alternative explanations scatter in all directions. There were no predators large enough to hunt it. Nothing in the Carboniferous forest possessed the jaws, the teeth, the size, or the speed to bring down a creature of Arthropleura's mass. Food was abundant and would remain so for millions of years. The biomechanics of its exoskeleton and musculature might have been sufficient to support that size without any atmospheric oxygen advantage. Its body plan segmented, distributed across many leg pairs. Distributed strength was inherently efficient at carrying weight. All of these are speculative. All of them lead nowhere certain. What we know with certainty is that Arthropleura dominated the forest floor. It was the largest land invertebrate ever to have existed, the apex herbivore of the soil and understory, the largest creature of the Carboniferous ground, and it ruled this niche for tens of millions of years. Then, around 299 million years ago, at the edge of the Carboniferous Permian boundary, as one epoch ended and another began, it vanished. What killed it is unknown. What replaced it is unknown. It simply left the fossil record and never returned. The Carboniferous produced Arthropleura, and then, when that epoch closed, Arthropleura closed with it. What Arthropleura represents is a kind of evolutionary endpoint that cannot be exceeded. Its size was not a temporary achievement, not a staging post on the way to something larger. It was the ceiling. No land invertebrate before or since has exceeded its mass or its length. This tells us something profound about the constraints of living without a backbone, without internal skeletal support, without the complex organ systems that vertebrates developed. There are limits to what an exoskeleton can support. There are limits to what an open circulatory system can serve. There are limits to what muscles can accomplish when they attach to chitin rather than bone. Arthropleura lived at those limits. It existed at the absolute edge of what was possible, and then, when those limits began to shift, when the Carboniferous ended and new climates arrived, the ceiling moved lower. Arthropleura could not adapt. It could only vanish. But Arthropleura was not the apex of the Carboniferous food web. The ground was its domain, yes, the mud and the leaf litter and the subterranean cavities. But above the canopy in the open air, in the suffocating, spore-laden sky, a different predator held court, and it was hungry, it was patient, and it could fly. Part 4. The sky belonged to insects. In 1885, a French paleontologist named Charles Brongniart described a fossil from the coal measures near Commentry, France. He named it Meganeura monyi, after the great nymphs of Greek mythology. Today we call it a griffinfly, though it is not a true dragonfly. The distinction matters to specialists, but would have meant nothing to anything living when Meganeura patrolled the Carboniferous skies. The wingspan was 75 centimeters. For perspective, a red-tailed hawk, one of the largest raptors in North America, has a wingspan of about 120 centimeters. Meganeura was smaller, but still formidable. 75 centimeters of wing spanning the air, wider than a human body, is long. When it spread its four wings transparent, veined with what looks almost like intelligence, it was the largest flying insect ever to exist. It was an aerial predator with capabilities that modern insects cannot match. The biomechanics of its flight were extraordinary. 4 independent wings did not beat in unison like dragonfly wings. They operated with what researchers call powered maneuverability, each wing articulated separately, allowing Meganeura to hang stationary in mid-air, to dart sideways, to climb vertically, to execute the kind of aerial gymnastics that gave it dominion over its domain. It hunted in the open air. It dove toward prey, items, smaller insects, flying arthropods, perhaps even small tetrapods, unlucky enough to venture into the canopy. It climbed, it turned, it spiraled. It had no competitors. The oxygen story seemed to explain Meganeura perfectly. Dense air provided more lift. Thicker atmosphere meant wings could generate more force. A larger creature could become airborne and remain airborne because the air itself was denser, more substantial. Everything made sense until the Snelling paper hit in March of 2026, and suddenly the simplicity evaporated. Meganeura did not exist in peak oxygen conditions. It thrived during the Pennsylvanian, yes, but not at the very peak. And again, we are left asking, what is the real mechanism? What allowed a creature this large, to take flight without the dense air hypothesis. The absence of aerial predators is itself remarkable. There were no pterosaurs. They did not evolve for another 30 million years. There were no birds. They did not exist. For 60 million years, the entire span of the Carboniferous, there was nothing in the air that could threaten an insect of size. Nothing larger, nothing faster, nothing with jaws and teeth adapted for aerial predation. Meganeura was the emperor of empty skies, an apex predator with nothing above it, a creature of pure dominion. This was an evolutionary garden party hosted by insects alone. On the ground and in the crevices of bark and the dark places of the forest lived other arthropods equally strange. Pulmonoscorpius kirktonensis, a scorpion that reached 70 centimeters in length, occupied the ground layer with its pincers and its venomous tail. It was found at East Kirkton in Scotland, a site famous for its terrestrial fauna. For years, it was confidently dated to the Lemurian age. Then Garza and colleagues published new research in 2025, redating the specimen firmly to the Middle Lower Visayan, around 335 million years ago, earlier than anyone thought, before the peak oxygen, before the oxygen story could explain it. A creature larger than many modern lizards, walking on 8 legs, hunting in 300 million year old darkness. Something else was going on, something we do not yet understand. The rhocoids, the ancestor form of modern cockroaches, belonging to the group Blattoptera, were the most abundant insects in the Carboniferous forests. They scuttled through the leaf litter and the rotting logs. They consumed the detritus. Some specimens reached 50 centimeters. Moroccan fossils from 2025 revised our understanding of Poroblattinidae, an ancient lineage whose body plan has remained essentially unchanged for 320 million years. Cockroaches walked into the Carboniferous and walked out 300 million years later, carrying the same blueprint, the same shape, the same strategy. They are the definition of evolutionary success, and they achieved that success alongside giants that would vanish entirely. Now place yourself in that world. Stand on the waterlogged forest floor and listen. Imagine standing on the spongy peat, surrounded by the darkness of the understory, unable to see more than a few meters in any direction because the giants above block the sky. Now listen. The Carboniferous soundscape is what haunts paleontologists most when they reconstruct deep time. There is no birdsong. The silence of that fact is deafening. No frog calls, no amphibian chorus, no mammal vocalizations, no vertebrate voices at all. The acoustic environment was alien, dominated entirely by arthropods, a world of insects and arachnids and myriapods, a world where every sound is the sound of evolution in a different form. Insects made hissing sounds as a threat display the oldest known acoustic deterrent, dating to around 320 million years ago. The sound of friction, of air pushed through spiracles, a warning without words. They clicked and buzzed as they moved, their bodies vibrating against each other in the darkness, creating a constant susurrus, a sound like wind through leaves, except the sound itself came from the creatures. Meganeura's wings, when it flew, generated a sound that echoed through the forest, a roar, a whip crack of air pushed aside by massive wings, a sound that nothing living had ever heard before, because nothing like it had ever existed. The frequency would have been distinctive, the rhythm of 4 wings beating out a pattern that matched no other creature. The wind moved through the scale trees, whistling through gaps in bark that had been dead for millennia, the trunks still standing, still shedding leaves, still creaking under their own weight. The wood groaned as it dried and flexed and settled further into the peat. And the constant crackle of fire. Wildfire in these forests was frequent and intense. Lightning sparked during the humid afternoons, fanned by wind pushing through the canopy, consuming the dead wood, the fallen trunks, the dense understory. The sound of fire is distinctive, the pop and hiss of moisture evaporating, the crack of wood splitting in heat, the roar of flame consuming oxygen faster than the air can be replaced. Fire was as much a part of the Carboniferous soundscape as the insect buzz, the hiss, the click, the creak, the wind. This was the last era when insects held the absolute apex of the food web above the waterline. The last era when a creature with 6 legs and wings ruled the skies unopposed. No vertebrate challenged Meganeura. No vertebrate competed with the rhocoids. No vertebrate hunted Pulmonoscorpius. The invertebrates had inherited the earth, and for 60 million years they remained in sole possession of that inheritance. But the Carboniferous was ending. The glaciers advanced farther. The climate continued its cooling cycle. The oxygen levels would begin to fall. The scale trees would begin to decline. The spore clouds that had fed Arthropleura and the rhocoids would become less abundant. The world would change, and the insects would find that their dominion was temporary. That dominion would not survive the Permian. The Permian would bring new challenges. It would bring new climates, drier and more hostile. It would bring new forms of life. Change was coming, and it was arriving on 4 legs in a form no larger than a human hand, carrying inside its body something that would reshape the entire future of terrestrial life. That revolution was already happening, right then, right there, in the shadow of the scale trees. It was happening in the hollowed-out stumps where Hylonomus laid its eggs. It was happening in the forests where small reptiles hunted insects and survived, and nothing could stop it. The egg had been invented. The terrestrial world would never be the same. Part 5. The Egg That Conquered the World. In 1860, a paleontologist named William Dawson was working at the Joggins Fossil Cliffs in Nova Scotia, that same site that would later become a UNESCO World Heritage location, that same place where the Bay of Fundy's tides, the most extreme tidal range in the world, still expose fossils 300 million years old. He found a specimen inside the hollowed-out remains of a lepidodendron trunk. The preservation mechanism was remarkable. The tree had died and fallen into a swamp. Its center had rotted away over centuries, leaving only the hollow cylindrical shell of the trunk. Animals had fallen into this pit trap, this grave, this time capsule. They died in the darkness. Their bodies were buried by sediment. The rock formed around them, and there they waited. The specimen was only 20 centimeters long. Compared to Arthropleura, it was a mote of dust. Compared to Meganeura, it was invisible. It was a small reptile. It was an insectivore, a creature that hunted insects and spiders in the dark spaces of the forest. Its name was Hylonomus lyelli, and it lived 310 million years ago. In its own moment, in its own time, it was utterly unremarkable. No fossil collector in that Carboniferous world could have seen it and understood its significance. No ecosystem was waiting for it with bated breath. It was simply another small predator, hunting, feeding, reproducing in the shadows. Hylonomus was not the largest animal in the Carboniferous. It was not the most dramatic. By the standards of the time, it was almost invisible. A small predator hunting insects in the understory, breeding in the hollows of dead trees. But it carried something revolutionary inside its body. Females of the species were gravid. They carried eggs, not eggs laid in water, not eggs without protection. Eggs wrapped in a membrane system so sophisticated, so effective, that the strategy would persist unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. Would persist, in fact, until the present day. Would persist into your moment, into your own existence. The amniotic egg is one of evolution's greatest inventions. It is a sealed capsule, a self-contained world. The shell keeps water in and pathogens out. It is permeable to gases, but not to liquid, a barrier engineered so precisely that nothing larger than a molecule of oxygen can pass through, and yet they all do. The amniotic membrane surrounds the developing embryo, supporting it in fluid protecting it from shock and stress. The chorion handles gas exchange, oxygen diffusing in through the porous shell, carbon dioxide diffusing out through the same portal. The allantois, a specialized sac, manages the accumulation of nitrogenous waste, storing it away so the developing embryo does not poison itself. The yolk sac provides nutrition, a portable food supply that has no equal in the egg-laying world. Everything the developing animal needs to survive is contained within the egg. No need for a water body, no need for parental care in the sense amphibians require it, no need to rely on external moisture. An amniotic egg is a self-contained ecosystem. It is a womb made solid, a uterus you can hold in your hand. Lepidosaurs have it, turtles have it, crocodiles have it, squamates, every snake, every lizard have it, birds have it. And mammals, well, monotremes, like the platypus, lay eggs that retain all these membranes in miniature. But other mammals, we have something more. The amniotic egg evolved. It was modified over millions of years. The shell became unnecessary. The membranes remained, but were retained inside the mother's body. The yolk sac became smaller, then vestigial, then functionally transformed into the umbilical vesicle. And that envelope system, those protective membranes that began as an adaptation for life on land 300 million years ago, became the placenta, became the umbilical cord, became the architecture of human pregnancy, the structure of human development, the biological foundation upon which every mammal, including you, right now, reading this, is constructed. Every person reading or listening to these words owes their existence to a creature that, 300 million years ago, figured out how to wrap its babies in protective membranes before releasing them to face the world. We have not left that logic. We have only internalized it. In 2025, a bombshell paper arrived in the journal Nature. Long and colleagues reported finding clawed amniote trackways in the Snowy Plains Formation near Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. The fossils were dated to the Tournaisian, 358 to 354 million years ago. These tracks preserve the footprints of animals that had already evolved, the amniotic egg animals that had already solved the problem of terrestrial reproduction. They were pushing back the origin of amniotes by 35 to 40 million years, earlier than Hylonomus, possibly back into the late Devonian. The egg might be even older than the Carboniferous itself. The innovation might have originated in an era we barely understand, in the depths of deep time before our best fossil record can confidently illuminate. This changes everything. Romer's Gap, the mysterious interval in the fossil record between the late Devonian and the early Carboniferous, where tetrapod fossils simply vanish, has puzzled paleontologists for decades. The record jumps forward in time and suddenly there are abundant tetrapods again, as if life simply stopped and then restarted. But if amniotes, creatures with eggs, originated before that gap, then they were present during it. They survived in places our fossils did not preserve, and if they were present, they survived. When the rainforests collapsed at the Devonian Carboniferous boundary, when the swamps dried up, when the amphibians that depended on water for reproduction died by the millions, the creatures with amniotic eggs survived. The egg was an insurance policy. The egg was a life raft. The egg was the difference between extinction and continuation. And that is the true miracle of Hylonomus, of those 20-centimeter creatures hiding in the hollowed-out stumps of scale trees. It is not what they were. It is what they carried inside them. The future. The egg was not the largest innovation. The egg was not the most dramatic, but it was the most consequential. Every mammal alive today, including you, is a descendant of creatures that evolved the amniotic egg. Every bird alive today is a descendant of creatures that possessed the amniotic egg. Every reptile, every snake, every lizard, all of them owe their existence to this innovation. The egg made the terrestrial world possible. The egg made the vertebrate conquest of land inevitable. The egg, laid in a hollow stump by a creature no larger than a modern lizard, began a chain of evolution that would eventually produce dinosaurs, birds, mammals, and ultimately, thinking beings capable of looking back at those 300-million-year-old fossils and asking what they mean. There is something else you need to know about the Carboniferous before we move forward into its depths, something that contradicts the image of a stable, eternal forest. The Carboniferous was not gentle. Those forests burned, frequently, intensely. And in those moments of burning, in those hours when the vegetation became fire, the creatures that survived were not the largest. They were not the most impressive. They were the ones small enough to hide, small enough to carry their young in a sealed, protected space, small enough to inherit a burning world. As we venture into the next part of this story, as we explore what these ancient forests were actually like, to move through, to live in, to hunt in, you must remember, the Carboniferous was not a paradise. It was a proving ground, and something was about to prove itself worthy. Part 6. A world on fire. The air in the Carboniferous world contained something we would find suffocating and terrifying in equal measure. Oxygen levels had climbed to somewhere between 30 and 35% of the atmosphere. Modern air, the air you are breathing right now as you listen to this, holds about 21% oxygen. That difference might sound small. It was not. At oxygen concentrations above 25%, fire becomes a tyrant. Flames burn brighter, they burn hotter, they spread with a hunger that appears almost alive. At 35%, the threshold approaches something chemistry textbooks warn about with genuine alarm: spontaneous combustion. Dry organic material does not need a lightning strike anymore. It ignites itself. The air itself becomes a weapon in the hands of heat. The evidence is written in coal seams across every continent where the Carboniferous left its geological fingerprint. Fusane is the technical name, though most of us would call it fossil charcoal. It appears in those coal deposits with such regularity and abundance that geologists can barely believe what they are reading. Some seams contain charcoal comprising 10 to 20% of the total volume by weight. Think about that proportion. Imagine walking into a coal mine where 1 out of every 5 shovelfuls of material is pure charcoal. Charcoal that tells a story. Charcoal that is the burned remnant of ancient forests. Charcoal that proves beyond any doubt that fire was not an occasional event, but a structural part of the Carboniferous ecology. This is not the thin layer of an occasional forest fire. This is the signature of a world in chronic combustion. The record shows fire cycles repeating roughly every 100 years with remarkable consistency. Entire regions transformed by flame, then briefly healed, then burned again. A world that learned to burn, learned to regrow, learned to adapt to the reality of routine incineration. A recent review published in 2024, titled "Fire in the Carboniferous Earth System," confirmed what the rocks had been shouting. This was the first period in Earth's history where wildfire became a dominant ecological force. Not an occasional disturbance, not an outlier, a fundamental part of how the planet functioned. Imagine for a moment the simple act of striking a match. The flame that appears at the tip is hotter and brighter than you expect, because oxygen is doing exactly what oxygen loves to do, making things burn. Now imagine a world where that same chemical reaction happens constantly, across continents, in vast coal swamps and forests that have never known human fire suppression or forestry management. The meganeura, that dragonfly the size of a sparrow that we discussed before, found itself grounded by smoke on days of regional burning. Arthropleura, the millipede scorpion, the length of a car, could flee, but not truly escape. These were creatures that had evolved in a world without this level of combustion, and the rapid change pushed them toward the margins. Fire became an architect of ecology itself. A forest consumed by flame does not immediately return as it was. For years afterward, it is an open clearing, a blank canvas. The species that recolonize these post-fire spaces are not the slow-growing giants that dominated before. They are the quick-burning pioneers, the plants that reproduce rapidly, that ask little of the soil, that anticipate catastrophe by reproducing constantly. The Carboniferous ecology learned to dance with fire in the way that modern California has learned to dance with fire, except there was no water from dams, no fire trucks, no human interference. Only adaptation or extinction. There is an elegant and terrible irony embedded in this period. The more oxygen that filled the air, the more vigorous the combustion became. More fire meant more carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere. More carbon dioxide, paradoxically, created conditions for less oxygen production. Oxygen concentrations actually feed back on themselves through a system that operates with the precision of a thermostat. The system regulated itself through fire, a self-limiting feedback loop confirmed by a paper published in 2025 by researchers named Chu, Mishra, and Lee, who mapped the correlation between atmospheric oxygen and Carboniferous charcoal abundance with precision that would have astonished Alfred Wegener. They found the relationship so tight, so consistent, that it became clear the system was intentionally limiting itself. Consider the mechanism at work. Forests grew, sequestering carbon in their tissues. That carbon came from atmospheric carbon dioxide, drawn down through photosynthesis. When those forests burned, the carbon was released back to the air. But the burning also consumed oxygen, reducing its atmospheric concentration. Lower oxygen meant less vigorous combustion, fewer fires, more carbon left in the forest. More carbon in the forest meant less carbon in the atmosphere, allowing oxygen to rise again. More oxygen meant more fire. Around and around, a cycle that self-regulated, like a biological thermostat. The forests that buried carbon in the depths, creating the coal we would eventually mine, were also burning that same carbon back into the sky. A constant negotiation between burial and combustion. Post-fire clearings filled with quick-growing plants provided food for herbivores, which fed the carnivores. Fire created diversity even as it terrified. A complex dance between oxygen and carbon and life itself. A planet trying to achieve equilibrium and failing, over and over for 100 million years. Yet in that failure was hidden a strange kind of success, a system that could exist, that did exist, that reproduced itself continuously without the need for outside management or correction. The ecosystem that evolved in response to fire became sophisticated and specialized. Plants that depended on fire to open space adapted rapidly. Animals that needed the food resources that sprouted in burned areas became common. Predators that hunted in the temporarily clear spaces became successful. A food web was woven around the assumption that fire would come regularly. Every species that thrived had some relationship to fire. Either they depended on its absence for shelter, or they depended on its presence for food, or they depended on its effects for reproduction. Fire was not a catastrophe that the ecosystem had to endure. Fire was a cornerstone of ecological function. But something extraordinary was happening in a different part of the world. While the equatorial rainforests burned with regularity that would terrify any modern forester, while Arthropleura crawled through scorched clearings and Meganeura wheeled through smoke-filled skies, the southern hemisphere was freezing. And it was freezing so thoroughly, so completely, that the paradox seems almost unbelievable. The same planet, the same moment in time, opposite ends of the world, experiencing opposite catastrophes. The southern ice was not a minor event. It was an extinction machine. It was an ocean-level regulator that would swing 100 meters up and down like the largest pendulum ever constructed. It would rewrite the rules of life for every species that had learned to survive on this burning, freezing world. Ice and fire, two apocalypses running in parallel, separated by latitude but not by time, one pole burning while the other froze. One region where life was abundant, and another where life was being erased by glacial ice. the most extreme climate differentiation in Earth's history at that moment. Part 7. The ice at the bottom of the world. The Late Paleozoic Ice Age, abbreviated LPIA by researchers tired of saying the full name, lasted for 105 million years. It began approximately 360 million years ago and did not truly end until 255 million years ago. Think about that duration. The Quaternary Ice Age, the one that humans have lived through and adapted to and documented extensively, lasted only 2.5 million years. The LPIA was 40 times longer. It dwarfs the Ice Age we consider normal, the Ice Age that shaped our species. In terms of sheer glacial extent and intensity, the LPIA remains the most extreme glaciation of the entire Phanerozoic eon. Nothing before or since has come close. No asteroid impact triggered this ice age. No volcanic winter. It grew from the planet's own chemistry, from the carbon buried in forests, from the feedback loops of a system that was eating itself. The peak of this enormous freezing event occurred in the latest Carboniferous period and extended into the earliest Permian. At its maximum, Gondwana, that southern supercontinent composed of what would eventually become South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia, bore up to 25 separate ice sheets. 25. Not one unified glacier that could be described simply. Not a coherent ice cap. 25 independent ice sheets that waxed and waned according to their own local climate patterns, advancing and retreating on schedules that only sometimes synchronized with their neighbors. Imagine the complexity. Imagine trying to predict what would happen when one ice sheet advanced while another retreated. When they retreated, the oceans rose. When they advanced, the oceans fell. The sea level fluctuated by as much as 100 meters. This is not background noise. This is a planetary metronome that every creature living on shallow coastal plains had to internalize or die. Shallow water animals learned to abandon their homes and return. Fish learned to migrate. Forests learned to drown and grow again. The coal beds contain a record of this dance. Layers of marine sediment alternate with layers of coal and terrestrial rocks in a pattern called cyclothms. Each cycle represents one pendulum swing. Ocean rises, seawater floods in. Marine organisms fill those new shallow seas. Algae and shells accumulate, layer upon layer. Then the ice advances, the ocean falls, the land is exposed again. Forests regrow, coal forms. Then the ocean returns. The cyclothms can be counted in the rock record like rings in a tree, each one a testimony to the rhythm that governs survival and extinction. A paleontologist examining a Carboniferous coal basin can count cyclothms and determine how many ice advance retreat cycles occurred. The sediment itself becomes a clock that ticks at the rhythm of glacial cycles. Here is the paradox that keeps Carboniferous researchers up at night. While the southern hemisphere froze under the weight of ice sheets that would pile kilometers into the sky, the equatorial regions remained tropical. Vast coal forests grew in peat swamps that stretched across the equatorial band of the planet. The same moment witnessed ice caps and rainforests, glaciation and coal formation in coexistence that seems to violate every instinct about how climate should work. Hot at the equator, frozen at the poles, a system not in equilibrium but in a kind of dynamic stasis. The answer lies in how those coal forests created their own fate. The carbon buried in those seams was carbon removed from the atmosphere. As plants grew in superabundance, as they died and sank into anaerobic swamps, as they were compressed into coal, the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere declined. Less greenhouse gas meant less heat trapped near the surface. A cooler world meant more evaporation at the equator, more precipitation in the tropics, but also an unstoppable cascade toward glaciation at the poles. The coal forests caused the Ice Age, the largest negative feedback loop in climate history. Think about what this means. A successful forest removes carbon from the air. Successful removal of carbon cools the climate. A cooling climate spreads ice sheets. Ice sheets reflect sunlight back to space, amplifying the cooling. More cooling means less carbon dioxide can be absorbed by vegetation because it is colder. But less carbon dioxide in the air means less greenhouse warming, allowing the ice to spread further. The system regulated itself toward catastrophe. It succeeded so well at removing carbon that it froze itself. The coal forests were not villains. They were simply doing what successful life does: growing, reproducing, thriving. But their success had consequences that rippled through the entire climate system. No predator could stop them. No competitor could outpace them. They grew and grew and grew, and with each growth they drew more carbon from the sky, and the sky grew colder and the planet froze. A victory that became a curse. Success that became catastrophe. The evidence for this ice age is not theoretical. It is written in rocks across the southern continents. A paper published in 2025 examined glacial deposits in the Paraná Basin of South America and correlated them with evidence from Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia. The correlations are uncanny. Striated bedrock, dropstones, boulders carried within icebergs and dropped onto ocean floors as the ice melted. Tillites, deposits left behind by glaciers, containing a random assortment of rocks of every size, unsorted and jumbled, the signature of glacial movement. Each of these features tells a story. Striated bedrock shows where glaciers passed over stone and abraded it smooth. Dropstones show where icebergs carved from glaciers and drifted out to sea. Tillites show where glaciers dumped their load of broken rock and debris. Alfred Wegener, the scientist who proposed continental drift in 1912, used this very evidence to support his radical idea. The glacial deposits matched too perfectly across continents, too far apart to have drifted there independently. The ice sheets of the Carboniferous helped prove that continents move. Glaciers had moved the continents. Time and temperature had rewritten the map. Here is the human connection that closes the loop. The coal we burn today was buried during the Carboniferous. Every time we ignite a Carboniferous coal seam, we are reversing 300 million years of carbon burial in a matter of seconds. We are taking carbon that was removed from the atmosphere and putting it back in. We are, in essence, speeding backward through geological time at an impossible velocity. The ice age that took 100 million years to freeze the planet can be counteracted in 2 centuries of fossil fuel combustion. The system that created that ice age learned a lesson. It learned how to regulate itself. We are learning a different lesson entirely. But the ice age did not appear immediately at the Carboniferous boundary. There was a stretch, a terrible stretch, of 15 million years at the very beginning of the period where something went wrong, where the normal rules stopped applying, where the fossil record becomes fragmented and incomplete and almost impossible to interpret. It is in this gap, in this darkness, in this silence, that the future of vertebrate life was determined. The survival of amphibians would depend on events that we cannot see. The invention of the amniotic egg would occur in the blind spot. The rise of reptiles would be hidden from the fossil record. And when the rocks finally speak again, when the fossil record resumes, the world will be different. The game will have changed. New rules will apply. Rules that would govern life on land for the rest of Earth's history. Part 8. The gap nobody can fill. In the 1950s, a paleontologist named Alfred Romer made an observation that still haunts vertebrate paleontology. The Devonian period, which preceded the Carboniferous, was rich with fossils, fish evolving into tetrapods. Tiktaalik, the creature we discussed in our opening, was walking on limbs and breathing air and returning to water as needed. Ichthyostiga, another pioneer, was exploring what life beyond the ocean might mean. Acanthostega, with its 8 fingers on each hand, was experimenting with the possibilities of land. Tetrapods were flourishing in the Devonian oceans and swamps. Multiple species, multiple body plans, multiple evolutionary experiments. The Devonian fossil sites overflow with specimens, diverse fish faunas, transitional forms, tetrapod pioneers competing for resources in the water and on the margins of land. The Devonian is a treasure trove. It is a window into a time when vertebrate life was explosively diversifying, a period of evolutionary creativity that seems almost unlimited. Then the Carboniferous begins. The clock starts at 359 million years ago. For the first 15 million years, the fossil record of tetrapods essentially vanishes. This absence, this hollow silence, is called Romer's Gap, one of the most frustrating mysteries in paleontology, a period of deep time when something essential happened, but the rocks refused to speak. Paleontologists have searched everywhere in these rocks. They have dug through formations in North America. They have excavated deposits in Europe. They have searched in Asia and Australia, and the records are blank. The Devonian ends, the Carboniferous begins, and the tetrapods are gone, hidden, erased, lost in time. The theories about what happened in that missing time are as varied as paleontologists who study it. One hypothesis suggests it was a real extinction, the Hangenberg event, a pulse of anoxia that poisoned the oceans and eliminated most tetrapods that remained dependent on aquatic breeding. Oxygen vanished from the water column, sulfide built up in the depths. It was a chemical catastrophe. In this view, the gap is not an artifact of preservation. Something truly died. The tetrapods that had diversified so successfully in the Devonian were nearly wiped out. Only scattered survivors made it through, and they had to reinvent what it meant to be a tetrapod. It was a bottleneck, a near-extinction event that shaped everything that came after. Another hypothesis suggests the opposite, that tetrapods were thriving, but the conditions that preserve fossils simply did not exist. Acidic soils in the tropical lowlands dissolved bone. Intense weathering destroyed potential fossils before sediment could entomb them. In this scenario, the gap is a false absence, a phantom created by the stones refusing to remember. The tetrapods were there. They were living and dying and evolving. We simply cannot see them. The question of which hypothesis is correct has profound implications. If tetrapods nearly went extinct, they were fragile. They survived by chance and rebuilt from a tiny population. If they thrived unseen, the fossil record is unreliable. It captures only what it captures and hides the rest. We must learn to read between the lines, to infer from absence what might have been present. Beginning in 2012, a researcher named Jenny Clack and her colleagues published a discovery in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that began to fill the silence. In Scotland, at the base of the Carboniferous, they found tetrapods, 5 new taxa that had survived the Devonian Carboniferous transition. The silence was being broken, new species emerging from the gap, evidence that life had continued. In 2016, another study by Anderson and colleagues revealed a diverse fauna at the bottom of the gap, evidence that tetrapods had not vanished, they had transformed. Multiple species, multiple body plans. The gap was not complete. It was just incomplete, a partial silence rather than absolute darkness. Then, in 2025, a bombshell. Long and colleagues published evidence of amniote tracks in Australian deposits from the Tournaisian age, the very earliest Carboniferous, not bones, tracks, footprints made by creatures walking on clawed feet. These are not vague impressions. They are detailed traces showing claw marks, showing the pressure of the foot pushing into mud. Crown group amniotes, the ancestors of all reptiles, all dinosaurs, all birds, all mammals. This is not a late arriving colonist. This is not a creature that evolved elsewhere and migrated to Australia. This is evidence that amniotes were present at the very beginning of the Carboniferous, not just surviving the gap, walking on land, laying eggs that did not require liquid water to hatch, already beginning the revolution that would make terrestrial life truly possible. The amniotic egg, that revolutionary technology, had been invented somewhere in this darkness, somewhere in this 15 million year blind spot, and the evidence for it appears in tracks pressed into ancient Australian mud, frozen in stone for 358 million years. A ghost of a discovery, an echo of a presence, a footprint that proves something extraordinary had happened while the world was not watching. The lesson of Romer's Gap is profound and unsettling. The fossil record is not a complete history. It is a book with pages missing, chapters dropped into the void. Entire species lived and died without leaving a trace that the rocks could preserve. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The origin of egg-laying vertebrates, one of the most transformative innovations in the history of life, occurred in a window that we cannot fully see. We catch glimpses. We find fragments, tracks from Australia, bones from Scotland. But the full transformation happened in darkness, in a time that the rocks have refused to fully record. We can infer what happened. We can model it. We can theorize about it. But we cannot witness it directly. This is the fundamental challenge of paleontology. We are reading a book written in stone, but the ink is imperfect. Some chapters were never written at all. Some chapters were written in materials that did not survive. Some chapters were erased by chemical weathering or physical destruction. We are left with fragments, and from those fragments we must try to reconstruct a complete narrative. It is like trying to understand a film by watching a single frame every 50 frames. Most of the action is invisible. Most of the transformation is hidden. Yet we must piece together what we can see and extrapolate from there. The greatest revolution in vertebrate terrestrial colonization is hidden from us by time and the limitations of preservation. But the evidence that we do have, fragmentary and incomplete as it is, tells us that something extraordinary happened, something that changed everything. When the fossil record resumes beyond the gap, when the tetrapods emerge fully formed into view, it is transformed. It is broken by a new catastrophe. Something that would change the trajectory of vertebrate evolution forever. Something that drove an entire epoch toward a new master class. The amniotes had arrived. The reptiles had awakened. The creatures that could lay eggs on dry land had inherited the world, and the world would never be the same. The amphibians, the dominant vertebrates for so long, were no longer the default. A new possibility had emerged from the darkness. A new way of life had been invented, and it would reshape everything. Part 9. The day the rainforest died. 305 million years ago, the climate changed. Not gradually, not smoothly, in geological terms, quickly. The Carboniferous rainforest collapse, abbreviated CRC by researchers, restructured the entire ecological foundation of the Carboniferous world. The climate became cooler and drier. The Gondwanan glaciation intensified. The ice sheets advanced farther into the southern hemisphere, expanding their dominion. Sea levels fell by approximately 100 meters. The Appalachian and Hercynian mountains, the collision zones where continents were welding together, altered the patterns of water flow. Rain that once fell reliably on swamp forests now fell elsewhere or did not fall at all. The mountains acted as barriers, creating rain shadows. Moisture-laden air, moving inland, hit the peaks, dropped its burden of water on windward slopes, and descended as dry wind on the other side. The continuous forest that had stretched across equatorial regions fragmented into isolated pockets, separated islands of survival in a sea of drying land. A forest that had covered an area larger than the modern Amazon was suddenly broken into disconnected refugia, small populations stranded in places that were no longer connected to their neighbours. For the amphibians, this catastrophe was existential. Amphibians, by their fundamental nature, require standing water to breed. Their eggs do not have the membranes and shells that protect developing embryos from drying out. The larvae must develop in liquid water. The adults, though some could survive on land for extended periods, needed access to reliable wetlands. An amphibian far from water is a creature with a ticking clock. Dehydration is always nearby. When the rainforest collapsed and the water disappeared, the amphibians found themselves stranded in shrinking refugia, pockets that grew smaller with each passing year, cut off from other populations that began to decline, to dwindle, to fade toward local extinction. Some species survived in the refugia, but at reduced population size. Others were made extinct entirely. The age of amphibian dominance, which had lasted for hundreds of millions of years, entered its final chapter. The dominance would not disappear overnight, but the trajectory was set. The amphibians had been king. They were about to be dethroned. For the reptiles, the collapse was an opportunity. Reptiles had already evolved the amniotic egg during the gap that Roma could not see. That innovation, that fundamental technology, meant that a reptile could lay its eggs in dry soil. It did not need standing water. It did not need to return to a swamp. It did not need to depend on the availability of water-filled refugia. A female reptile could venture into drier regions, find suitable soil, deposit her eggs, and leave. The offspring would develop safely, protected by a leathery shell and internal membranes that prevented dehydration. The embryo had its own water supply, sealed inside an egg within an egg. As the rainforest died and the climate dried, the reptiles colonized the newly available habitats, the drying savannas, the shrublands, the seasonal forests where water came and went. They speciated. They diversified. They began their rise toward dominance. What had been marginal habitat became prime real estate. The reptiles were positioned perfectly to take advantage. In 2010, a paper by researchers named Sarney, Benton, and Falcon Lang articulated an argument that has only strengthened in the years since. The Carboniferous rainforest collapse was arguably the single most important event in vertebrate evolution. It tipped the balance decisively away from amphibians and toward reptiles. Without that collapse, without that moment of climate change and forest fragmentation, the trajectory of life on land would have been fundamentally different. Mammals might never have evolved. Dinosaurs might never have emerged. Humans might not exist. An entire planetary future pivoted on the drying of the equatorial forests. One moment, one climate shift, one change in precipitation patterns, and 300 million years of evolutionary possibility opened up. The giant arthropods felt it too. The period of invertebrate megafauna was ending. Arthropleura would not survive the Carboniferous. These giant millipedes that had crawled through the moist undergrowth needed humid conditions. They needed the coal swamps. An exoskeleton, while protective, is porous. Water evaporates through it constantly. In a humid swamp, evaporative loss is manageable. The arthropod drinks water and replaces what is lost. But in a drier environment, the arthropod loses water faster than it can replenish it. There is a limit to how much water a millipede can drink, and there is a limit to how little water it needs to lose to remain alive. As the swamps shrank and dried, Arthropleura had no refuge. The creature that had ruled the Carboniferous undergrowth was incompatible with the climate that was emerging. It faced extinction not because a predator hunted it to death, but because the air itself became hostile. Meganeura would see its family line collapse by the end of the period. The giant dragonflies that had dominated the skies were losing their niche. These creatures were air breathers, and the thinner humidity of a drier world meant they struggled to extract oxygen efficiently. The dragonflies would continue, but dwarfed, smaller, less dominant than their ancestors had been. Modern dragonflies are impressive by our standards. They were puny by Carboniferous standards. The insects would not disappear, but the era when the largest terrestrial herbivores were arthropods, the era when a creature with an exoskeleton ruled the undergrowth, was closing. The age of insects was becoming the age of reptiles, not because insects were inherently inferior, but because they had evolved for one world and were now living in a different one. The parallel to modern times is uncomfortable and unavoidable. We are fragmenting forests right now. We are creating islands of habitat in a sea of human alteration. We are changing the climate and altering water cycles. The mechanism is island biogeography. The term refers to a principle discovered in the 20th century. When a large habitat is fragmented into smaller pieces, the populations within those pieces shrink. Smaller populations are more vulnerable to extinction because they have less genetic diversity, less flexibility, less ability to adapt to changing conditions. We are creating the conditions for a collapse. We are watching, in real time, as the largest terrestrial ecosystem in the world fragments into disconnected islands. Whether we intend to trigger a collapse comparable to the Carboniferous rainforest collapse remains to be seen. But the mechanism is not unfamiliar to the rocks. We have learned from geology, we have learned the dangerous lesson that one change can cascade through an entire ecosystem. The Carboniferous teaches us that systems which seem stable can reach a tipping point. Once that tipping point is crossed, the transition can be rapid. The forests learned this lesson 300 million years ago. The question is whether we will learn it in time. The collapse driven by those colliding continents, by the mountains that rose and blocked the rain, set in motion something greater still. Because those colliding continents, that tectonic dance, was not finished, the collision would not stop. It would continue. It would build something larger than mountains. It would build a supercontinent. It would assemble the largest landmass in Earth's history. And that supercontinent would be the fuse for the largest explosion of death that the planet has ever witnessed. The creation of Pangaea was the beginning of the end. Part 10. The supercontinent fuse. Throughout the Carboniferous period, the continents were moving toward each other on a collision course that neither rocks nor life could prevent. La Ruche, that amalgamation of what would become North America and Europe, was drifting southward. Gondwana was drifting northward. The reek ocean that separated them was closing, its crust subducting, its waters disappearing into the mantle. The ocean floor was being consumed. The seaway was shrinking. The distance between continents was collapsing measurably with each passing 1,000 years. By approximately 310 to 300 million years ago, the collision was complete. The continents had fused. Pangaea was born, a supercontinent so vast that it dominated the entire planet's surface, a single mass of land surrounded by a single ocean. A world map that would be almost unrecognizable to anyone accustomed to the familiar outlines of modern continents. During the Carboniferous, the Appalachian Mountains were not the worn-down ridges that modern hikers know. They were as tall as the Himalayas. They were young mountains, fresh from the collision, still rising, still deforming, still buckled upward by the immense forces of continental convergence. The height is almost unimaginable. 300 million years of erosion and weathering have reduced them to ghosts of their former selves. But, in the Carboniferous, they were towering walls. These mountains created rain shadows. Moisture-laden air, travelling inland from the oceans, was forced upward by the mountain walls, cooled, and dropped its precipitation on the western slopes. By the time the air descended on the eastern side, it was dry. The interior of Pangaea became increasingly arid. Deserts began to spread. Those rain shadows helped trigger the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. Mountains are not just geographic features. They are climate engines. They reshape weather patterns. They determine where it rains. They determine where life can flourish. But the collision also created something else: subsiding basins. The weight of the collision, the crumpling of the crust, the geological chaos of continental convergence produced deep basins that sagged downward. Into these basins flowed sediment. Into these basins poured water and organic matter and coal. The rivers from the dying rainforests flowed into these basins. The debris from the eroding mountains fell into these basins. The basins filled and filled with sediment. The mountains that killed the forests also created the basins in which coal accumulated. The architecture of contradiction, destruction and preservation occurring in the same geographic locations. Coal is the record of forests written by fire and preserved by burial. The basins preserved the history even as the climate destroyed the reality. Pangaea was not a temporary configuration. Once formed, it would persist through the Carboniferous and dominate the entire Permian period that followed. A supercontinent has consequences that reach far beyond simple geography. A supercontinent has less coastline than the same landmass broken into separate continents, much less coastline. When the world's landmass is broken into separate continents, each one has a coastline where water and land interact, where heat can transfer from ocean to air, where moisture can be generated and distributed inland. But when all the land is joined in a single supercontinent, the coastline is minimal. Less coastline means more limited interaction between ocean and atmosphere, less energy transfer from water to air. The climate becomes more extreme. It means more extreme continentality, climates that are hotter in summer and colder in winter, deserts in the interior and storms on the edges. The interior of Pangaea was essentially a vast desert, with rainfall arriving only in concentrated bands. It simplifies ocean circulation because there are fewer passages for water to move through. The ocean loses its ability to distribute heat evenly. Water that was warmed at the equator could not easily flow to the poles. Heat remained concentrated in tropical regions. Life loses flexibility. The entire biosphere becomes brittle. Pangaea in the Permian was a world out of balance, a world pushed to extremes, a world waiting for something to break. The supercontinent had created the ideal conditions for catastrophe. In the Permian, approximately 252 million years ago, something happened that would weaponize the supercontinent's geometry. The Siberian traps erupted, massive flood volcanism that poured lava across the continent for hundreds of thousands of years. Volcanism on a scale that the modern world has never witnessed. The Siberian traps interacted with Pangaea's climate system. The eruptions released greenhouse gases that trapped heat. The sulfur compounds released by the eruptions blocked sunlight. The oceans acidified as carbon dioxide dissolved in seawater. Oxygen disappeared from the water as temperature rose and circulation collapsed. The combination of effects, acting through a supercontinent that was already stress-tested and brittle, triggered the Permian Triassic extinction event. 96% of marine species vanished. 70% of terrestrial vertebrates died. The worst mass extinction in Earth's history. Not second place, not close, the worst. A single moment in time when life nearly ended. When the planet came close to becoming a world of microbes and silence, Pangaea was a concentrated system. A system with nowhere to hide, nowhere to refuge from the effects of that eruption. Pangaea was a fuse. The Carboniferous lit it. The collision of continents, the closure of oceans, the rise of mountains, the burial of carbon, the fragmentation of rainforests, the evolution of amniotic eggs, the rise of reptiles. All of it was preparation. All of it was set up for the detonation. 50 million years of chain reaction from the assembly of the supercontinent to the eruption of the traps. A 50 million year fuse burning toward the worst catastrophe in paleontological history. The Carboniferous built the conditions. The Permian paid the price. The Carboniferous period was the most creative and self-destructive epoch in Earth's deep past. It built coal from forests. It drew down carbon dioxide through its very success, through the success of plants at removing carbon from the air and burying it in swamps. It froze the poles and superheated the equator. It grew monsters that scaled to the limits of physics, arthropods as large as cars, dragonflies as large as seagulls. It invented the egg, that technological marvel that would transform vertebrate life forever. It collapsed rainforests and split them into isolated islands. It assembled the supercontinent that would dominate the next 100 million years. Contradictions upon contradictions. Destruction wrapped inside creation. Building and burning, creating and destroying. The Carboniferous was a period of extremes. We live in the Carboniferous aftermath. We mine the coal it left behind. Coal formed 300 million years ago is burning today. We burn the forests it stored as fuel. We breathe the oxygen it released in such excess that fire consumed continents. We inherit the egg, that innovation that enabled everything that walks on land today. Every land vertebrate alive right now is a descendant of creatures that evolved the amniotic egg in the dark gap that Roma could not see. We carry the reptile within us, the evolutionary inheritance of creatures that thrived when the rainforest died. Every mammal that walks the earth is a reptile that became something else. The Carboniferous did not end 299 million years ago. It ended one moment ago, and it is ending right now. We are living in the extended shadow of the Carboniferous. We are burning the aftermath of its success. Scientists at this very moment, in laboratories and dig sites and research stations across the planet, are discovering Carboniferous fossils that rewrite the story. They are finding tetrapod traces in Australasia that push the origins of egg-laying vertebrates earlier than thought possible. They are uncovering evidence of fire-driven ecology more sophisticated than previous frameworks allowed. They are reading the isotopes in ancient rocks and discovering climate cycles within cycles within cycles. The Carboniferous is not a closed book, it is an open question, and the answers arriving now are stranger than anyone expected. Each discovery rewrites what we thought we knew. Each fossil forces us to reconsider. The Carboniferous keeps speaking. We are still learning how to listen. Part 11. The Tyrant That Wasn't a Child. For 3 decades, paleontologists existed in a kind of professional embarrassment. They had a dinosaur in their collections, in their textbooks, in museum displays across the planet. Everyone called it what it was supposed to be. And then, in April of 2026, 2 independent studies published in Nature revealed that what everyone had agreed upon was wrong. The animal called Nanotyrannus, that curious small tyrant reptile, was not what science thought it was. It was not a juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex accidentally mistaken for something interesting. It was its own species entirely. A legitimate animal wearing a name that now felt almost ironic, given that we had been calling it the tiny tyrant for 30 years while thinking it was someone else's baby. Here is what changed. The first study came from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, examining the hyoid bone of Nanotyrannus, a small bone in the throat, nothing glamorous, nothing that sounds like it would settle a 3-decade argument. But the ceratobranchial elements within it contained growth rings. The kind of growth rings you see in tree trunks, concentric circles marking seasons of growth and dormancy, rings that tell the story of a creature's life compressed into the mineral structure of bone. These rings indicated something profound. Nanotyrannus was not growing anymore when it died. It was an adult, a small adult, yes, but mature, not a teenager awaiting its growth spurt into becoming a proper Tyrannosaurus rex. The ceratobranchial growth ring patterns, revealed through careful analysis, demonstrated skeletal maturity. The bone had stopped expanding, the cartilaginous caps had calcified, the trajectory of development had reached its endpoint. This creature had finished its life cycle where it was. No future growth awaited, no transformation from tiny killer to massive tyrant was coming. The rings told an honest story if you had the patience to read it. The second study examined an even more remarkable specimen. For years, it sat in private collections, known only to specialists and wealthy owners of ancient things. Called the dueling dinosaurs because it showed, in three-dimensional detail preserved in Montana stone, a Nanotyrannus locked in struggle with a Triceratops. The skeleton told its own story in ways that previous examinations had missed. Growth rings showed the animal was approximately 20 years old when whatever killed it, killed it. The spinal vertebrae had fused a sign of maturity, the vertebral column locked into its final form, unable to bend or flex any further. The skeletal features did not match Tyrannosaurus rex at any stage of development, not infant, not juvenile, not subadult, not anywhere on the growth trajectory that biologists could construct. The forelimbs were proportionally larger than in juvenile T-Rex. The teeth count was higher. The tail contained fewer vertebrae. The skull nerves traced paths incompatible with anything in the T-Rex growth sequence. This was not a juvenile. This was something different, something its own. The proportional architecture of the skeleton, the relationship between limb length and body mass, between jaw power and cervical strength, suggested specialization, a creature engineered for a different way of hunting than its much larger cousin. It was designed by evolution for a different ecological role. The implications tremored through Hell Creek, Montana, where these animals lived 95 million years ago during the late Cretaceous, in river systems that would eventually be buried and fossilized and discovered by paleontologists who would argue about them for decades. The ecosystem textbooks everyone had written suddenly needed revision. Two apex predators, two large tyrannosaurids, shared the same floodplains, the same hunting grounds, the same food webs. Nanotyrannus was not half the size of a fully grown Tyrannosaurus rex. It was not dwarfed, it was specialized differently. An adult Nanotyrannus measured roughly half the length of a fully grown T-Rex. But its skeleton revealed a creature engineered for a distinct ecological position. Perhaps it hunted different prey, smaller creatures that the massive T-Rex could not be bothered with. Perhaps it moved through floodplain environments in ways the larger predator could not, using speed and agility rather than raw power. Perhaps it occupied a niche carved by different hunting strategies, by different prey preferences, by different ways of surviving in an environment that had room for more than one kind of killer. Perhaps they did coexist, each claiming parts of the same world without erasing the other, establishing a division of resources that allowed both to thrive. The fossil record, which seemed to demand that only one large tyrannosaurid could occupy an ecosystem at any given time, had been lying all along. When the name Nanotyrannus was first coined, it seemed obvious what it meant: a tiny tyrant, a small version of the king lizard, a junior member of the tyrannosaur family. And for 30 years, paleontologists carried that assumption like stone in their pockets. Fossils seemed familiar, and familiarity breeds confidence, and confidence resists change. But the tools of science do not stand still. New technology, synchrotron imaging, three-dimensional reconstruction, statistical growth modeling did something older methods could not. It forced honesty. It said, you were wrong. Not incompetently, not carelessly, but wrong, and now you know better. Now you must revise the textbooks. Now you must acknowledge that your certainty was misplaced. This is what you should understand about fossils, the things we dig from stone and display in glass cases and write dissertations about. A fossil that seems to fit a known pattern can hide a completely different story underneath. A bone can look like it belongs to a juvenile form when it actually represents something that never existed before, at least not in our awareness. The Nanotyrannus debate is not a shameful chapter in paleontology. It is a demonstration of how science advances, not by declaring certainty in the face of incomplete data, but by testing old assumptions with new tools. and then, when the evidence demands it, walking backward and rebuilding from the beginning. Scientists are not infallible, but science, as a process, as a method, as a way of asking and answering questions, contains within itself the capacity to correct its own mistakes. Yet the question lingers, and you might feel it settling in your mind like sediment. If a fossil as famous as Nanotyrannus, studied, debated, published, taught, could be fundamentally misidentified for 30 years, what else is wrong? What other assumptions persist in museum collections, gathering dust, waiting for a technology that hasn't been invented yet? How many misnamed dinosaurs sit in temperature-controlled storage in institutions around the world, their true identity locked away, waiting for someone patient enough, curious enough to look again? The Carboniferous taught us that understanding the past is not a finished project. Each generation of science must be prepared to overturn the last, and perhaps the next generation will overturn this one. In the darkness where you drift towards sleep, consider this: we are perhaps the first creatures ever to have the privilege of being wrong about such magnificent animals, and the privilege to know it and to change our minds. But what comes next will be stranger still, a creature so perfectly misidentified that it took machinery that did not exist a decade ago to reveal the truth. A creature that never should have been in the fossil record at all. Part 12. The octopus that never was. In the fossil collections of the world, there lived an octopus that nobody should have believed in. It had a place in textbooks. It appeared in museum displays. Paleontologists cited it as evidence for the antiquity of cephalopods. Documentaries mentioned it when discussing the ancient origins of intelligent invertebrates. It held a Guinness record as the oldest octopus known to science. And when it was alive, really alive, in the ancient sense, that means it roamed the Carboniferous seas of Illinois. Nobody was there to see it. We only knew it as a fossil, a compressed, darkened impression in stone. A creature that told us the octopus was far, far older than we wanted to admit. A creature that rewrote the timeline of cephalopod evolution. For more than a century, Pulsipia seemed to be the answer to a question paleontologists had not yet learned to ask properly. Its name was Pulsipia mazanensis. It came from Mason Creek in Illinois, which you have already encountered in this act as a Carboniferous lagerstätte, a place of exceptional preservation, where forests turned to coal and ancient life got locked in stone so complete that you can count the segments on a trilobite's body or see the imprint of a dragonfly's vein pattern down to the tiniest detail. 300 million years old. That is what the fossil record said. An octopus, no older sibling to be found, no ancestor, just Pulsipia, sitting at the root of octopus genealogy, confounding evolutionary biologists who believed the split between octopuses and their squid cousins should have happened much, much later. The molecular clock said octopuses should not exist until the Jurassic 150 million years in the future. But there was Pulsipia, seemingly ancient, seemingly first, seemingly impossible. Mason Creek is a Carboniferous lagerstätte of extraordinary richness and completeness, a window into a vanished world preserved in exceptional detail. The preservation was so complete that even soft-bodied creatures left traces. Then, in April of 2026, researchers from the University of Reading aimed something remarkable at this fossil. They used synchrotron radiation, imaging X-rays brighter than the sun, so energetic they could reveal hidden structure inside stone without destroying the stone itself. They were looking for something specific, something that would tell them whether Pulsipia was truly an octopus. What they found was a radula. That is the technical name for a feeding apparatus, a ribbon of teeth, structures that cephalopods have, yes, but arranged in a very specific pattern. Rows of teeth running across the radula like a microscopic garden. Counting them was the key to understanding what this creature actually was. 1 row, 2 rows. A typical octopus has 7 rows, sometimes 9 rows. These are standard. These are consistent across all modern octopuses. But Pulsipia had at least 11 rows per strip, sometimes more when the preserved structure was mapped with precision using the synchrotron's powerful imaging capability. The geometry was wrong. The symmetry was incompatible with octopus biology. The arrangement suggested something else entirely, something that lived in an older branch of the cephalopod tree, something that predated the octopuses themselves by millions of years. The radula was the smoking gun, the evidence that had been hiding in plain sight, locked inside stone, waiting for the right technology to reveal it. The truth emerged from the fossil itself once examined with sufficient honesty. Pulsipia was not an octopus. It was a nautilus relative. A cephalopod. Yes. A squid-like creature. In some ways, yes. But not an octopus. What they had been seeing for decades was the result of decomposition weeks of soft tissue breakdown in an oxygen-poor Carboniferous lagoon, organs collapsing against each other, limbs contorting and rearranging, the whole body remapping itself into something that looked remarkably like 8-armed chaos. The process of decay had been a process of disguise, each stage of dissolution creating a silhouette that matched the textbooks better than the actual creature ever could have. The creature had been lying to paleontologists through the medium of death itself, its decomposition creating an accidental false identity. The fossil published its correction in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B on April 8th to 2026. And octopuses, as a lineage, were suddenly relegated to the Jurassic period 150 million years later, arriving on Earth's stage just in time to miss the dinosaurs entirely. They were newcomers to the fossil record, not ancients. The Carboniferous had never held them at all. They were Mesozoic creatures, and their evolution took place in a world that the Carboniferous never knew. The irony should not escape you. The Carboniferous, that coal-forming epoch you have now heard described in detail, that buried greenhouse world of vaulting insects and sprawling amphibians, had fooled paleontology for 3 decades. The very period whose fossil record seemed so complete, so trustworthy, had hidden a lie in plain sight. Mason Creek alone preserves over 300 species. 300 distinct animals captured in Carboniferous limestone and shale, 300 windows into a world that vanished 300 million years ago. 300 opportunities for mistakes, for misidentification, for fossils to wear the wrong names. If one was misidentified so completely, so systematically, so long, how many others shelter secrets? How many fossils in how many museums are wearing the wrong names? Waiting for the next technology. Synchrotron imaging was the breakthrough here. But what comes next? What will the machines of 2068 see when they examine what we think we know? What assumptions do we carry now that will crumble the moment someone looks closely enough? This is the strange gift that the Carboniferous keeps giving to those who study it. Not just that it shows us what we got wrong, but that it teaches us to be suspicious of what we think we got right. Pulsipia was not a failure of paleontology. It was a demonstration of how the fossil record, for all its comprehensiveness in certain places, remains fundamentally indirect. You are looking at stone. You are inferring biology from shape. Sometimes shape lies, not on purpose, but thoroughly. Decomposition can create false narratives. Sediment can conceal anatomy. Incomplete preservation can suggest structures that never existed. And time, the great eraser, removes any possibility of asking the original creature what it actually was. The fossil is a message, but sometimes the message has been corrupted by 300 million years of burial. Yet there is another lesson hiding here, smaller and stranger. Sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes you find a fossil so unexpected that it forces you to redraw the entire tree of life. Not because you were wrong about what it was, but because what it is suggests that something you were certain about was false. In this act, you will encounter such fossils. fossils that walked out of the stone and demanded that science rewrite itself. Pulsepia reminds you to be ready. The Carboniferous is not finished teaching, and some of its lessons are still buried, waiting in the darkness for someone clever enough to extract them. Now consider a creature that was discovered and misnamed for so long that nobody realized it had been with us all along, a predator in the ancient Sahara, a fisher that nobody imagined. Part 13. The Hell Heron of the Sahara. In February of 2026, a paper arrived in Science magazine with a creature that made very little sense until it made perfect sense. Its name was Spinosaurus mirabilis. The last species of Spinosaurus to be formally described had been Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, identified in 1915 by a German paleontologist named Stromer von Reichenbach. More than a century had passed. 111 years of thinking that Spinosaurus was one thing only, one species, one design, one way of being a large predator. And now, from the deserts of Niger, came something new. Something that rearranged what people thought they knew about how the largest predators of the Cretaceous period looked, moved, hunted, and lived. Something that suggested the original description, made over 100 years earlier, had missed something essential about the Spinosaurus lineage. The first Spinosaurus species to be formally identified was not the last word on the genus. The name hell heron seemed absurd until you understood the proportions. The researchers from the University of Chicago and their collaborators examined the animal and compared it not to the massive aquatic reptile everyone assumed Spinosaurus to be, but to something far more ordinary, a blue heron. A living animal you might see standing in a marsh, hunting fish with patience and precision, striking with the speed of a spear. Scale a blue heron to 9 tons. Give it a narrow snout, engineered for stabbing fish, for gripping slippery prey, for hunting in ways that required finesse rather than crushing force. Give it a neck muscled for powerful downward strikes, for the explosive movement that a fisher needs when the moment comes. Give it legs built for wading in river channels, legs that could support its weight in water up to its belly. Give it a saber-like crest rising from its skull, more pronounced than anything seen in the original Spinosaurus aegyptiacus, a crest that would have been visible above the waterline, even when the body was mostly submerged, a signal to other Spinosaurus of who you were, a display of dominance or maturity. Give it interlocking teeth designed for gripping slippery prey, the kind of teeth that lock together in a way that resembles the hunting apparatus of modern crocodiles, each tooth fitting into grooves on its neighbours. Give it a jaw set lower than any tyrannosaurid, optimized for acquiring food from beneath the surface of water, for the quick strike and hold that a piscivore requires. Give it proportions that spoke not of a generalist apex predator, but of a specialist, a creature engineered for one specific ecological role. Then place it 95 million years ago in a river system that carved through what is now the Central Sahara, a place that was nothing like the desert it would become. That is Spinosaurus mirabilis, a 9-ton heron, a predator nobody had imagined correctly until the bones were examined with the full attention they deserved. The discovery carries weight because of its history. Fragments had existed, scattered in scientific literature, partial remains that suggested something interesting was there. For 70 years they waited. For 70 years, paleontologists looked at pieces of Spinosaurus and tried to construct an animal from incomplete information, assembling what they thought ought to be there rather than what the bones insisted they were. Fragments from Niger had existed, known to researchers, sitting in collections, waiting for someone to take them seriously. Debate centered on whether Spinosaurus was primarily aquatic or terrestrial, as if those were the only two options. As if a creature could not be both, could not be something entirely different from anything alive today, could not specialize in a way that made it unique. Then new material emerged from Niger, and new descriptions were prepared. New eyes examined the question. The picture coalesced. Not a massive aquatic reptile cruising river channels like a crocodile, something more specialized, something more strange. A fisher that hunted the way no dinosaur had hunted before, using patience and precision rather than explosive power. The new species suggested that Spinosaurus was a lineage of specialists, each species adapted to a particular way of hunting. The Sahara itself is a revelation here, one of the richest fossil deposits on the planet, preserving ecosystems that thrived when Africa looked nothing like it looks today. Rivers flowed where now only sand exists, cutting through the terrain with the same patterns that rivers cut through geography now. Fish teemed where now only wind moves, species adapted to river life, hunted by creatures engineered to hunt them. Vegetation choked the water's edge, plant species that would become extinct long before the modern world, yet whose descendants shaped the evolution of everything that lived alongside them. The Central Sahara, 95 million years ago, was a lush river system, a place of water and life. And along that edge walked the hell heron, stalking with the patience of something that had learned to hunt in a way that made it invisible to most of the animals around it. Not a roaring apex predator announcing its presence with sound and aggression. Not a desperate scavenger taking what it could find. Something patient, something cold, something perfectly constructed for one specific way of killing. The deeper lesson is about geography and time. The Sahara exists now as desert, seemingly empty of life, seemingly hostile to paleontologists seeking fossils. But geography is not permanent. It shifts. It changes. It transforms itself according to rules governed by climate, by ocean currents, by the movement of continents. What is sand today was water once, and might be water again. The desert that dominates northern Africa now was not always desert. The fossil record does not distribute itself evenly across the planet. Some regions reveal their secrets. Others hide beneath geology that makes excavation prohibitive or impossible. But that does not mean nothing lived there. It means we have not looked hard enough, or we have not looked in the right way, or we have not yet developed tools sharp enough to see what is already visible. The hell heron waited in the Sahara for more than a century before anyone understood what they were looking at. And there is another truth here, patient and significant. The researchers who found Spinosaurus mirabilis were not following the obvious trail into unexplored territory. They were looking where others assumed nothing significant remained. They were taking seriously fragments that generations of paleontologists had dismissed. This is how paleontology advances. Not always through massive new expeditions into untouched territory. Sometimes through the stubborn refusal to accept that we have already learned all there is to know. What other hell herons wait in deserts, in museum collections, in the gaps between what we have found and what we have dismissed as trivial? What other specialists hunt in ancient rivers, their skeletons sitting in storage rooms, waiting for someone to wonder why they look so strange? The next revolution in paleontology might come not from digging deeper, but from looking more carefully at what we have already found. The hell heron teaches us that the past is not a closed book. It teaches us that fragments can hide secrets. It teaches us that a creature can be present in the fossil record, studied, even displayed, and still be fundamentally misunderstood. The hell heron was there all along, in the stone, in the collections, in the papers and catalogues. But it took the right question, the right approach, the right moment of curiosity to see what had been visible the whole time. And somewhere in a museum in Niger, somewhere in an archive of paleontological records, there are probably other hell herons waiting, other creatures that everyone assumes they understand, other fossils that the next generation of scientists will look at and see something entirely different from what we see now. Part 14. The sponge that rewrote animal origins. The molecular clocks that biology uses to track evolutionary time suggested something troubling. They said sponges, the simplest animals, the ones that first invented what it means to be something that eats rather than makes its own food, originated around 700 million years ago. The mathematical models were consistent, the calculations checked out. 700 million years was when the first sponge diverged from its closest living relative based on genetic distance and rates of mutation. Yet the oldest fossils that anyone could confidently identify as sponges dated to 540 million years ago, 160 million years of missing history, a ghost epoch, a period when sponges should have existed, when the molecular calculations insisted they must have existed, but nobody could prove it from the fossil record. The gap grew larger and more troubling with each passing year. Where were the early sponges? Why didn't they leave fossils? Why did biology and geology seem to be telling different stories about when animals first appeared on Earth? Then, in 2026, a team led by Shuhai Xiao from Virginia Tech examined a fossil from the Yangtze River region of China that nobody had quite known what to make of. Called Helicolocellus, it was 550 million years old. Not a lot older than the Cambrian period fossils that filled textbooks, but older. Sitting right at the boundary between two epochs, at the threshold. Different from anything else preserved at that time and place. The structure was conical, roughly 15 inches long, with a box-like surface patterned with what seemed like organized structures. Examined carefully with the precision that modern technology allows, it bore the characteristics of a glass sponge, one of the most primitive lineages, still alive today in the deepest parts of the ocean, still drawing water through its body with the simplicity of something that had barely changed in geological time. Glass sponges, also called hexactinellids, are living fossils, organisms that trace their lineage back further than most animals on Earth. Their closest living relatives are animals that lived hundreds of millions of years ago, and Helicolocellus appeared to be their ancestor, or close to it, preserved at a moment when sponges were first beginning to build hard skeletons. Most closely related to modern glass sponges, Helicolocellus represented a transition point between soft-bodied ancestors and the mineralized forms that would dominate the fossil record. The paper appeared in Nature. A reviewer called it a Rosetta Stone for understanding how animals began. Because Helicolocellus, sitting at the boundary between the Ediacaran epoch and the Cambrian explosion, bridged the gap between two different worlds. It was a bridge made of sponge. The solution was not that sponges suddenly appeared in the fossil record like magic. The solution was that sponges had always been there. The earlier ones, the ones that lived during those 160 million missing years, simply had not fossilized. They lacked the mineral skeletons that the later ones developed. They were soft. They fell apart when they died. Only in exceptional circumstances, rapid burial in the right kind of sediment, in the right kind of chemistry, did they survive the journey to stone. Helicolocellus was one of those exceptional circumstances, a sponge preserved by chance in the right place at the right time. And it opened a window into a world that had seemed invisible, hidden behind the fog of incomplete preservation. The earliest sponges were there all along. We just could not see them. The fossil record had been lying by omission. This connects to the Carboniferous. Throughout this act, you have encountered a recurring pattern. The fossil record lies not because it fabricates, but because it is incomplete. Gaps exist not because those organisms did not live, but because they did not fossilize. Romer's gap in the Carboniferous was another such moment, a period of 5 million years, where almost nothing seemed to survive in stone, yet vast evolutionary changes must have occurred. The Carboniferous terrestrial life seems to vanish, then suddenly reappears, changed. The mislabeled octopus was another soft tissue, decomposing into something unrecognizable, creating a false fossil identity. The hell heron was waiting, partially preserved, partially ignored, until the right researchers paid attention. The pattern emerges. Fossils hide, fossils get lost, fossils get misidentified. But the Carboniferous teaches something else. Sometimes, rarely, fossils come back. The Cambrian explosion, that sudden radiation when animals with hard skeletons flooded into existence, was not an explosion of creation, it was an explosion of preservation. Hard shells could fossilize. Hard exoskeletons could survive the journey through geological time without decaying completely. Teeth could survive. Bones could survive. And so the fossil record, for the first time in Earth's history, could see what was already there. The animals had been accumulating for hundreds of millions of years, evolving slowly, spreading into new ecological positions, learning how to hunt and hide and eat and reproduce. But we could only see them once they started building structures that could turn into stone and carry their story forward to paleontologists in the 21st century. Helicolocellus is evidence of that invisible world, a ghost animal made briefly visible. Most sponges never fossilized. Most died in environments that would destroy every trace of their existence. But occasionally, in the right conditions, one would be preserved. Helicolocellus was one of those rare preservations, that exceptional circumstance where the universe decided to keep a record, and that record changed everything. It bridged the gap between what biology told us should exist and what geology had been showing us. It allowed us to understand that the silence in the fossil record was not a silence of absence, but a silence of preservation bias. And it teaches us something we need to know. What we see in fossils is not nature. It is nature filtered through the bias of preservation. Most of what lived left no trace. Most of the history of life is invisible to us. The Cambrian explosion was an explosion of preservation, not of creation. Life had been present and evolving for hundreds of millions of years before we could finally see it. And somewhere in that hidden history, animals lived and died and left no record. Vast ecosystems thrived and vanished without leaving a single bone or shell or trace for us to find. We are blind to those worlds, cut off from them by the simple fact of chemistry. We see only what the universe bothered to preserve. This is the great humbling of paleontology, the recognition that the fossil record is not a library but a collection of miracles. Each fossil represents countless others that were not preserved. Each bone we find is a witness to millions that decayed to nothing. Each fossil species we name might represent just one individual from a population of thousands or millions. The gaps in the fossil record are not mysteries to be solved. They are the natural state of things. What surprises us is not what we do not find, but what we do. Helicolocellus teaches us that the rarest fossils, the oldest ones, the ones that bridge great gaps in time, are often the most important. They are the keys that unlock entire chapters of hidden history, and they are waiting, scattered through rocks and museums, for someone curious enough to look. Part 15. The fossils that came back from the dead. Between the time when dinosaurs still ruled and the time when dinosaurs were gone, there existed a moment of such catastrophic death that 96% of all species living in the ocean simply ceased. The boundary between the Permian and Triassic periods, 250 million years ago, marks the worst extinction event in Earth's history, the Great Dying, some researchers call it. A time when the ocean became hostile to life, when the atmosphere changed, when the world remade itself in ways that killed almost everything. Life did not recover gracefully, it recovered strangely. In Australia, in deposits from the Triassic Ocean that would be lifted high above sea level by tectonic forces over the following 250 million years, there lived creatures that nobody expected to find. Marine amphibians, tetrapods that had returned to the sea. Animals like Erythrobatrachus nuncambahensis, first formally described in 1972, belonging to a group called the Trematosaurids. They had breathed air, but chose water. They had limbs, but had made them suited for swimming. Limbs that suggested a history on land before a return to the ocean. They had retained teeth and jaws suited for catching prey in the dark ocean depths. They were failures in some evolutionary sense, because their lineage did not lead to anything modern, did not produce descendants that would eventually walk on land again. They were successes in another sense, because they lived multiplied, and spread across ocean systems in the millions of years immediately following the worst extinction the planet had ever experienced. They filled the void left by the marine reptiles that had died in the extinction event. They were the inheritors of a catastrophe. Then the fossils disappeared. Decades passed. Specimens from Western Australia, uncovered during expeditions in the 1960s and 1970s decades of careful paleontological work, of careful excavation, of careful curation, were collected, studied, described, and catalogued. The papers were published in peer-reviewed journals. The discoveries were entered into the scientific record. But the fossils themselves, held in museum collections, seemed to vanish from science. Researchers searched. Curators consulted records. Nothing. The animals were lost to institutional memory. The specimens from that rich Triassic deposit in the antipodes had gone missing in an age when fossils should never go missing, when every bone should be tracked and preserved and kept available for future study. The papers that described them sat in libraries as ghosts of knowledge, references pointing to specimens that could not be re-examined, ideas that could not be tested, conclusions that had to be taken on faith because the evidence itself had gone missing. How many other fossils vanish into institutional limbo, catalogued but lost, known but inaccessible? How many discoveries disappear into the bureaucratic chaos of museum storage? Until 2024, the fossils were relocated, found, returned to the light of scientific scrutiny after decades of absence. The work of finding them, of searching through museum storage, of reviewing records, of asking the right questions of the right people, was itself a kind of paleontology, a search through institutional history as much as geological history. And when researchers from around the world examined them again, publishing their findings in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology in February of 2026, they realized something extraordinary had happened. What had been described as one species was actually two. Erythrobatrachus was there, but Aphanorama was there also, a genus that had been hiding within what everyone assumed was a single species. A genus with relatives scattered across the Arctic, across Madagascar, across the vast territories of what used to be single landmasses before the continents began their slow separation. The molecular evidence and morphological analysis confirmed that these two lineages were distinct, separate, specialized in different ways for the same underwater world. Aphanorama had spread from the southern hemisphere to the Arctic to Madagascar, a global dispersal within millions of years of the extinction. Within mere millions of years of the most catastrophic extinction ever recorded, these sea-going tetrapods had spread globally. They did not cower after catastrophe. They used catastrophe as a launch pad. They radiated across the oceans with the speed of desperation and necessity, a group of amphibians that had chosen water and now found themselves inheriting a drowning world. And here, at the end of this act, you must consider the Carboniferous itself, not as isolated history, not as a single chapter in Earth's story, but as a moment whose consequences still ripple forward, still shape the world you walk in, still influence the air you breathe, and the energy that powers the civilization you inhabit. The Carboniferous buried carbon in the ground, transforming the bodies of plants into coal, sequestering in the crust the very element that, when released back into the atmosphere, changes climate. The Carboniferous froze the southern hemisphere, gathering continents into a supercontinent called Gondwana, altering ocean currents and atmospheric circulation, and every system that regulates planetary temperature. The Carboniferous burned its own forests in catastrophic wildfires that reshaped vegetation, fires that raged because the atmosphere was so oxygen-rich. The Carboniferous collapsed its rainforests, replacing lush growth with drier, sparser vegetation. The Carboniferous set the stage, through all of these transformations, for the worst extinction in Earth's history. Yet it also invented something else, the amniotic egg. A sac around a developing embryo that meant you did not need to return to water to reproduce. It meant reptiles could walk inland, could live away from the edge of lakes and rivers. It meant that From the Carboniferous forward, some of the most dominant creatures on the planet would be animals that laid eggs in the soil, that built nests, that cared for their young in the way that no amphibian could. The Carboniferous built the first reptiles. It gave insects their last reign as apex predators before vertebrates took over. It set the stage for every dinosaur, every bird, every snake, every creature with scales and eggs and the ability to survive away from the water's edge, including, through lineages that have never been broken, the creatures that eventually built your cities, invented your languages, created your consciousness. Every person alive is a consequence of the Carboniferous egg. So this is the final truth. The Carboniferous did not just shape the past, it still shapes the present. Every season of wildfires reflects the Carboniferous struggle with oxygen and heat and unburnable forests. Every extinction headline reflects the Carboniferous loss, the Carboniferous acceleration toward catastrophe. Every lump of coal that powers a city, every barrel of oil that pushes a machine, every unit of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, these are the Carboniferous, still present, still acting, still writing the story of what happens when a planet must choose between burning and freezing, between growth and collapse, between the old world and whatever comes after. 300 million years ago, forests could not rot, so they turned to coal. Atmosphere caught fire, so it changed the climate. Creatures found a way to keep going, because that is what life does. It adapts, it spreads. It uses catastrophe to reach places it could not reach before. You are that consequence. Your presence on this planet is a consequence of those ancient adaptations. Your future depends on understanding what the Carboniferous learned, that what you do with carbon, with energy, with the balance between growth and sustainability, echoes forward through millions of years. The Carboniferous is not finished. It is still teaching, and we are still learning to listen.